So our last chapter has to do with mergers and acquisitions. And of course, the fundamental purpose of the anti merger law was to prevent an increase in market power, and that could be accomplished by preserving competitively structured markets. So, the whole idea of regulating mergers, regulating acquisitions, is to prevent a single company from coming into larger amounts of concentration or market power. Of course, this goes along the claim that concentration itself increases market power and leads to poor economic performance. But of course, from what we've already learned from both economic logic and our antitrust book, this is not actually the case. Just because you have more concentration of resources doesn't necessarily mean the amount of competition in the market has decreased, nor does it necessarily mean you have more influence over that said market. If you're in a market, say, where uh, you have a whole bunch of price takers and whatnot, like when we were talking about the great electrical conspiracy, where if one person dropped the price, everyone immediately starts buying from the person who dropped the prices. So the competition is forced to meet that lower price. But if they wanted to, say, increase the price, they'd be out of luck because they'd lose all of those sales. While this says that if they had the concentration, they should have more market power, so therefore those giant companies like Westinghouse and General Electric should have had the power to be able to increase the price in the market and get all the sales, but yet that was not the case. Another good example, of course, is OPEC, and that's in a situation where we're even closer to the perfect competition category since we're talking about oil and gasoline, which has very little differentiation in it. But yet we have another situation where even though OPEC tries to increase the prices and supposedly has all this great market power, the price of oil is very little influence from OPEC these days. So the misallocation, of course, of resources would be limited by more competition. They say that if we go in and we stop these mergers, we stop these acquisitions, the people who are in favor of this kind of a law say that we would prevent the misallocation of resources. Now we have some different types of mergers. First off is the horizontal merger. And this is a merger between two corporations that sell the same thing. So if Toshiba's laptop division went and bought Hewlett Packard, HP's laptop division, they're buying the same thing. That would be a horizontal merger if it was just between those two divisions. Of course, the argument here immediately says that doing this decreases the amount of competitors within a specific market at a given moment. A decrease in the number of competitors does not mean there is a decrease in the competitiveness and rivalry in that market, though. And there is no scientifically provable perfect level of concentration. So, since we have no way to prove what the level of concentration that is perfect for that market is, how can we ever come out and say whether a acquisition or a merger will bring us closer to a situation of better competitiveness or not? We actually do not know. We don't have some sort of scientific theory that goes out there and proves what that perfect level of market power for every company should be. So how can we as a government sit back and say this is the level we need so you can't do this acquisition or merger? It's kind of ridiculous to think about. The other thing to consider is that mergers are done voluntarily. So when you have a situation where two companies are going to merge together, like what we saw with Dow and DuPont in the Midland area, the merger was done voluntarily. This wasn't forced by the hands of government. Dow Chemical didn't force DuPont and vice versa. They were done to allocate resources more efficiently. And that's why most mergers are done, because they see some sort of benefit of doing it. They don't just do it because one of the companies came through and is like, oh, you're going to merge with me or else, and then it's over. Now, you may have heard of the term hostile takeover, but believe it or not, even under a hostile takeover, you have a situation of a voluntary merger. Why is it still voluntary? Because all of those shareholders voluntarily sold to those individuals that gave them the votes in order to get the merger through between the two corporations. So the voluntariness happened by all those individuals selling their votes, their ownership of that company to the other individuals that wanted the merger. So another type of merger is the vertical merger. A vertical merger is a merger between a manufacturer and a supplier. So if you were, say, an aluminum foil manufacturer, if you bought the bauxite mines, or you bought the aluminum ingot company, or just merged with them between agreements, so you would be doing a vertical merger. Now, the argument here is that purchasing of a supplier is said to foreclose on competition and prevent them from being able to obtain supplies. So the fear is that if you let companies buy their suppliers, it prevents those suppliers from ever selling to their competitors again. However, economies are not a zero-sum game. The purchase of a supplier does not bar competitors from being suppliers or new suppliers from entering the market, nor does it prevent substitutes. So your competitors could open up another supplier, or somebody out in the market could see the opening and go, oh, I can beat them, I can start a supplier. So it doesn't prevent that from happening. And then, of course, there's the fact that there are substitutes. So if you come out and go, well, I'm going to not sell to you, well, the other company can go, well, okay, I'll go to a different type of supply then. So how is foreclosure profitable to a new owner of the supplier? The purchase of the supplier does not shift demand. So just because you buy this supplier doesn't mean that the entire demand curve magically shifts and they're able to make more money off this by keeping it. No, they're going to be in a situation where odds are in order to keep that supplier they just purchased profitable, they're going to have to sell their products still. Remember, a lot of these companies are based on economies of scale type situations. So if they just stop selling, their expenses per unit's going to come up and go up, and they're going to lose those big benefits that they had of doing the merger with that supplier in the first place, which was to combine the economies of scale, most likely. Those who argue that the efficiency gained and lower prices given to consumers restrict competition and harms consumers does not understand the point of competition. So there's this other argument out there that says that when you merge with your supplier in order to get your prices down to beat out the competition, and you come out and say that's wrong, you've completely forgotten or missed the point completely on what competition is all about. The competition is supposed to be undercutting your competitors and driving prices down. So when you're preventing companies from merging for that purpose alone, you are really lost. So another argument that comes out against mergers and acquisitions is the concept of squeezing. Companies that get stuck paying retail input for inputs while the output drops in price due to the competitors selling inputs at a lower cost to itself through its own supplier. So what this is say you buy a supplier, and when you buy that supplier, you start supplying yourself at cost. So whatever it costs you to produce that supplies, that's what you give it to yourself at. However, when you sell it to your competitors, you sell it for a margin. You sell it for a profit, so you mark it up. So the argument here is, well, that's unfair because you're producing items for yourself and not charging yourself that higher price. So you have that unfair advantage in the marketplace. However, that doesn't come at no opportunity cost. It's not suddenly free to do it to yourself. So when you do that, when you buy that supplier is now subsidizing in a way the company that it's supplying because it's no longer bringing in those profits. So you and the supplier have to get a larger profit margin out of the item you are selling, the end product, in order for this to work. So if you subsidize yourself with your supplier you bought, and you can't get enough cost savings from that alone to make back the margins of the supplier as well as the margins of your own company and increase overall, you screwed up. You shouldn't have done that merger in the first place. So there's a lot more to it than just that. It's not free. It's not some unfair advantage that's going on. These companies are just trying to leverage economies of scale and bring costs down. They're not trying to squeeze out the competitors. They're going to still sell to the competitors, and the competitors could go out and do the same thing themselves. It's not like they're stopped from creating suppliers. So technically speaking, the only thing being squeezed is cost or profit margins. There is no guarantee the new revenues gained through subsidizing one product at the cost of the new one owned by the supplier will turn more profit. Vertical margins are a threat to inefficient competitors. So think of that for a moment. So if you are up against a company and that company that you're competing with merges with one supplier and it cuts at the very foundations of your company was probably inefficient to start with. That small savings in costs shouldn't be able to undercut you so bad that you go out of business just because of one competitor merging with a supplier. It is the pretense of knowledge to presume to know the socially efficient number of sellers for a market. So, when we come out and we say that we know exactly what the perfect amount of sellers is, so when those judges come to the board and they decide whether two companies can merge or not, they technically have no idea what the socially efficient number of companies there are. There's no way to tell. We have no scientific method whatsoever to tell what the perfect amount of competition is in the market, what's the perfect amount of companies to be in each market. And this is for every industry specifically. So it is the pretense of knowledge to actually presume to know that. It's ridiculous to think that judges actually think they even know that. It's ridiculous to think that economists think they know that. So what is the socially efficient number of business owners for each industry? It's clear that the number differs from industry to industry, but how do we even know when we have reached that point? If we knew this number for every industry in existence, then we might have an argument as to how many mergers should be allowed. But as long as we don't have any proof, zero evidence of what that perfect number is, there's absolutely no reason why the government should be stepping in and deciding when companies should be able to merge or acquire other companies. So let's look at some anti-merger cases now. Our first is the Brown Shoe case. The case was whether to allow the merger between Brown Shoe Company and G.R. Kinney Company in 1956. Brown Shoe owned 4% of the shoe manufacturing industry and 845 retail stores. G.R. Kinney owned 0.5% of the shoe manufacturing industry and owned 400 retail stores. In 1956, there were 70,000 retail outlets that sold shoes, and this was only counting companies that sold just shoes. So if you had other companies that happened to carry shoes as well, you could add up to that number to those retail outlets as well. The argument against the merger was that it increased market concentration at a time when the trend in the industry was towards more concentration. So here we are in 1956, 60 years later from when that fear came about that larger companies immediately constitutes more concentration, and more concentration equals bad, even though we don't have any reasons to believe that that was the fear. The courts were trying to be proactive and stop the domino effect of mergers creating concentration. Not necessarily that this particular merger was outright dangerous. So in this particular case, we have courts that were trying to step outside of the box and be proactive. They wanted to prevent this idea that if you allow this merger to happen, it's going to create this domino effect of merger after merger after merger after merger. The competition's going to start merging with each other to try to compete with them. This company is going to go out and merge with even more companies because the competition merged with it, and so on. So they had this outrageous fear that mergers actually lead to more mergers, and it's going to be an immediate effect. So the concentration of assets in the hands of the largest manufacturers actually declined from 1947 to 1956. So more competition actually stepped in to this particular market, and the concentration was spreading much thinner. And maybe this is the reason why Brown Shoe and Kinney actually started looking at this ability. Of course, they saw the economies of scale benefits that they were going to see between the shoe manufacturing, and then they were both successful retail store chains. So they were hoping that the combination between the manufacturing ability as well as the retail stores would greatly improve their chances of survival and larger profitability in that particular industry when the industry was actually trending the other way. They may have lost market share themselves leading up to this point. During the period between 1948 and 1954, many shoe retail outlets were actually added. So, retail shoe outlets were starting to pop up all over the place in the market. So it's not like this merger was going to suddenly prevent all these other new shoe outlets from. In fact, when you follow on past this case, more shoe outlets end up coming to be. Some of the larger shoe outlets were actually still coming in the near future that were going to be much larger than anything that these companies own. It was also argued that the merger would prevent competition from entering the market, even though capital requirements to enter the market were relatively low. New efficiencies and lower prices to the consumer was also argued as a way competition could be prevented from hitting the market. So here the idea was, at least what the courts were arguing, was that if you allowed this merger, it would end up leading to lower prices for consumers. We as consumers would benefit from the merger. And that would prevent more competitors from coming in because the other competitors would have to be as efficient as this efficient company. Yeah, I know that one's pretty silly. But that's the thing that they are actually worried about. They were worried that the prices were going to be too low for consumers. So, in a way, they were arguing we needed to keep the prices higher so that more competition could come in. But isn't that the point of competition? The whole idea of competition is to lower prices, and here the courts were trying to technically prevent competitiveness in the marketplace. It was never even considered whether or not the merger would harm consumers, lower production, or actually harm the economy in any way. It was just assumed it could happen. So I've talked about that in some of the other cases. When you actually analyze these companies, you have to find something that's wrong. You can't just assume that it's going to happen or that it could happen or anything like that. You actually have to have evidence. And this is actually kind of an issue we've seen often in our business courts here in the United States, and we can even talk about issues in the European Union where they're still doing this kind of stuff. And of course, in the end, the merger was prevented by the courts, even though they had nothing to go on. They're just like, well, there's a chance this could happen, so we're going to block the merger. So next, let's look at Procter and Gamble and Clorox case. Procter was one of the nation's 50 largest manufacturers with a net sales of over 1 billion. Clorox at the time was a relatively small company with 12 million in assets and about 40 million in sales, but dominated the liquid bleach market. Clorox's product was not protected by any patent, and over 200 competitors actually made the same product. The courts argued that the increased economies of scale would lead to greater efficiencies and lower pricing, giving them advantage over the competition and allowing the new merged company ways to get more retail shelf space. So here again we see this fear that somehow lowering the price for consumers is going to prevent more competition from coming into the market instead of looking at it and going, actually, that's increasing competitiveness in the market. These companies are trying to combine up economies of scale, lower the price, and it's going to lead to benefits for the consumer, a raise in the standard of living for the consumer, a increase to economic activity. So there's all these benefits that were going to come from this merger. However, the courts feared that this is somehow going to block competitiveness. So this again is a proactive court stepping out and going, well, we think something bad might happen. And in the case this time, the thing they think is going to be bad is actually a good thing for the economy as well as consumers. There would be substantial cost savings in advertisement and sales promotion as well for Procter & Gamble and Clorox. It was argued that the competitiveness of the market would decline because Procter would no longer be in competition with Clorox. So here again, just because we saw the number of companies in the market that were producing go down by one, that necessitates the fact that competitiveness has gone down. But in reality, just because you have a merger doesn't mean there's any change in the competitiveness. In fact, we've seen over and over again throughout the history of the U.S. that we've seen more competitiveness come about in these markets as these companies compete even harder with one another when the changes come about. It was also argued that this merger could start a price war, a race to the bottom, lowering prices as a whole, which the newly merged company could come out on top. So they worried that the prices would drop substantially. And of course, that would harm us as consumers as we were able to afford more. So it was argued the merger would make the market more competitive and lower prices. So they were actually contradicting themselves between their two different arguments. Finally, it was argued a merger so productive of efficiencies would create barriers to entry in the marketplace. So because this company would be so efficient and would keep costs forever lower, that would prevent more competitors from coming into the market. But considering the whole point of competitiveness, again, is the lower prices, why do we care? We don't. We want to see those prices lower. That's the end goal. The whole point of anti-merger and antitrust and all these monopoly laws is to prevent companies from raising prices, not lowering prices. The FTC was never able to produce any proof of the following: companies barred from entry from the market, any decrease in competitiveness in the market, price increases, production increases, monopoly power, or monopoly profits. However, the merger was ordered to be broken up by the courts. So we can actually go on quite a bit about situations where we looked at mergers and we went, well, we need to prevent this from happening. Or even cases that have popped up, like the Dow and DuPont case was actually in the court system for quite a bit. It was there for quite a while on deciding whether they should let those companies merge. And there's very, very little of any economic talk in that court case. It was all politics. It has nothing to do with whether the economy is going to benefit or be harmed by it, whether the consumers are going to benefit or be harmed by it. So anyways, Chapter 9 kind of just wraps it up and kind of goes over a quick summary over it, and this is the only slide that we could go over for Chapter 9. It just kind of summarizes the lessons, of course, from the book. Antitrust laws have not been used to protect the consumer, which was their sole purpose. So these regulations came out from the government in order to protect the consumers, and in the end, technically, they have harmed the consumers because they were used for political gain or corporate welfare. Never were they actually used to protect the consumer. The main concerns in monopoly cases have actually been more to restrain competition than to actually benefit competition, especially in the cases we just saw with the mergers. Or we can even talk about the case in Alcoa or Standard Oil. I mean, it was case after case after case. We have situations where the monopoly case ends up leading to a restraint of trade and an increase in prices in the marketplaces instead of actually benefiting the marketplace and benefiting consumers. Economic analysis was left out of the cases for the most part. It's like the court judges didn't care. They didn't want anything to do with economics. Probably because they didn't understand economics. Why would they want to try to understand economics when they can just make an arbitrary decision? And then actual restrictions of trade and competition comes from the government. Restrictions on trade and competition is not coming from the marketplace. You go and if you want to talk about examples of restrictions on trade, one only needs to look at all the different regulations the government has put in, all the tariffs, all the quotas, licensing on occupations, all these different regulations that come out for the level that wages have to be, the kind of benefits that have to be provided, and so on. These are restrictions on trade and competition. Even the restriction of movement of labor, using work visas and things like that. Those are restrictions on trade and competition, and they all emanate from the government. And finally, the only harmful monopoly is one that is either created or protected by the government, because then competitive forces cannot come in and deal with that. So if Alcoa, for instance, was protected by the government, and that was the only reason that they had the kind of market concentration they did, that would be a major issue, and you would actually see an increase in price over time, like we've seen whenever we put in tariffs or anytime we put in quotas or any type of protections for companies. We see increases in prices and usually decreases in quality. But if you leave it to the market price, the prices decrease and quality increases. So hopefully you have enjoyed the antitrust book. So now that this is up, make sure you go and you take your quiz before the end of class. We'll have another discussion post that's up afterwards. Very good job on the discussion 2 post. There was no right or wrong answer to the monopoly question. Actually, I saw a lot of really good answers to that before you even went through this lecture, so I was quite impressed. Normally, people are pretty stuck on the myths that monopolies are automatically harmful in all situations. The next discussion question that has to do with monopolies, however, will be graded on accuracy. So I hope you have a good week and enjoy the discussion. Have a good day.